Well, on today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at Psalm 56 in our continuation of the looking at Psalms, and specifically Psalms that are, excuse me, that are titled and based on narratives that we see of David's life in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so this Psalm 56, is attached to what we see in 1 Samuel 21 regarding David and his time in Gath, and specifically when he pretended to be insane in their midst. Now, why did he do that? We'll talk about that in this episode, and as we look at Psalm 56. So some good things in store. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, if you enjoy Loving the Scriptures and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast. Follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also be sure to order a copy of my book if you haven't done so already, Signs of the End, What Jesus Taught His Disciples in the Olivet Discourse. As usual, I'll leave a link in the episode description. I'll take you to Amazon. You can order a copy. And also, please leave a review if you feel so inclined, an honest review. And whatever the case, whether you do that or not, I just hope that you read the book, and I hope that you're blessed by it. So we're going to be looking at Psalm 56 in this episode. And as I just said a couple of minutes ago, this is kind of an ongoing thing that we've started to do. I mean, we've been looking at the Psalms for a little bit now, but in the last couple of weeks, we've started to look at Psalms that are surrounded by the narratives of David's life, so that we can kind of get a little bit of background and context to what's going on in some of these Psalms and what might be on David's mind and David's heart as he's penning some of these Psalms here. Now, one of the things I did mention, because if you remember, last time we looked at Psalm 59, and then the episode before that, we looked at the narrative background of Psalm 59 in the narrative text of 1 Samuel. And one of the things that I'd mentioned when we started doing this is that it may not always be necessary to have a separate episode for the narrative background, and then another episode for the actual psalm, and that we might be able to do both the background and the psalm in one episode. There might be some, or many, who knows, where we can do that with. And this is one of those episodes. With Psalm 59, we did two separate episodes, one for the narrative background and then another for the actual psalm itself. In this episode, I think we can talk about the narrative background and the psalm together in one episode. However, there are two psalms that are attached to this narrative in 1 Samuel, which, by the way, is in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Let's see, verses 10 through 15. And so we're going to be looking at the other psalm too, but we'll divide up between the different psalms. That we will do. And so we'll look at the narrative background of these psalms on this episode, and then proceed to talk about Psalm 56. We'll do Psalm 56 on this episode, since it's the shorter of the two episodes, and then next week we'll look at Psalm 34. Now, Psalm 34, admittedly, there isn't a lot that when looking at the psalm where you might think, okay, this is definitely something that we can see that's connected to, what's going on in David's life at that point. And one of the things that I did say is that you don't necessarily have to have a one-for-one connection between things that you read in the psalm and things in the narrative. They might emerge in some of these psalms, but then again, it doesn't necessarily have to be. There may be, one or two areas where you can say, I can understand why, David would write this or something like that, given what's going on. But in much of Psalm 34, which that's the other psalm besides Psalm 56, Psalm 34, much of that psalm, you really don't get that indication. However, it's still a good psalm. And so I'm still a big fan of going through it. So that's what we're going to do. So this episode, narrative background, and then Psalm 56, and then next week we'll take a look at Psalm 34. So last time, and I guess when we say last time, maybe we could say the last couple weeks, because it's kind of surrounded one big thing here. In looking at Psalm 59, from the narrative perspective, we've kind of seen the beginning point of everything that's transpiring between King Saul and David. David, is one who God has anointed to be the next king of Israel and to take over Saul's spot at some point. That's still being worked out in the narrative and that sort of thing. But one of the things that we see with Saul, if we remember, and looking at everything that we have through all of that, is that Saul is on a downhill spiral, especially given the fact that, remember, we saw that the Spirit of God come upon David, which gives us an indication that the Lord is with David. But then right after that, you see, in the narrative, it says that the Spirit of God was taken away from Saul, and a harmful spirit came upon him. And this would be an occasional thing with Saul, with this harmful spirit and whatnot. And so, even within that, as things are going, further downward and everything, you have Saul trying to pin David to the wall with his spear and everything. All of this, this whole thing of this animosity that Saul has towards David, is because Saul is becoming more and more aware, suspicious that David is going to be the next king over Israel. Saul has already been told, because of your disobedience, the kingdom will be taken away from you. Will be given to somebody who's more worthy, somebody who is better than you. And that doesn't. And when David is the one that's kind of emerging in popularity and that sort of thing, this whole thing doesn't sit well with Saul. And so Saul wants to see David dead, even though, and I've pointed this out a few times, and I'll point this out again, is that you have somebody like Saul who swears and it gives an oath essentially, and says that, after Jonathan's trying to bring peace and everything like that, it says, I promise, I swear that David will not be put to death. And what do you see Saul trying to do, like a few verses later, trying to kill David? So that's kind of what we have going on there. And so, where we leave David, I mean, just with the things that happened that led to the occasion of him writing Psalm 59, Saul sent men to David's house to wait for him to come out in the morning so that they could kill him. David escapes. And so basically what we have now, as far as the narrative goes, is that David is a man on the run. Okay. He's a man on the run. And I don't want to spend a bunch of time filling in the gaps. I can just make a few brief statements here, and that when David escapes from his house, because Michael lets him out, by through the window or whatever, and he escapes. What you see that follows there is that you see a man in hiding. He goes and seeks out Samuel at Ramah at first, and then he hides a little bit at Ramah. He has a meeting with Jonathan, and Jonathan is one who says, "I'm going to try and get a feel for where my dad is at in all of this." And basically, what it comes down to is that not only does Saul reveal that he has in mind that, to put David to death, I mean, which again goes against his oath that he made before. Again, that tells you the kind of man we're dealing with. But he even also tries to kill Jonathan, his own son, as well. And I will read this real quick, because this is where Saul kind of unhinges here, when he's talking to Jonathan in chapter 20 of 1 Samuel, starting in verse 30. It says, "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan," so that he kindled against his son. "And he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" Now, by the way, so here again, because this is all building up against Saul, because what we saw in the narratives before is Saul having the same attitude towards, his daughter, Michal, David's wife. Because you get the sense that he feels betrayed by her because she let David escape. And now with his son, Jonathan is saying, he's essentially saying that you've chosen the son of Jesse, and you can maybe put in parentheses or in brackets, over me. I mean, that's kind of the idea. That's the sense that you have going on there. For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. And that would have been okay with Jonathan, because again, one of the things that we saw a couple weeks ago is that Jonathan acknowledges that he's not going to be the next king of Israel, and that his good friend David will be. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Then Jonathan answered Saul his father, why should he be put to death? What has he done? But Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him. So Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food, food the second day of the month, for he was grieved for David because his father had disgraced him. And so you go along in the story. Jonathan warns David and says, yeah, my dad, pretty much has it out for you. You better get out of here and go somewhere else. And so we go for a man in hiding, pretty much. I mean, he's always been on the run, but I mean, he's kind of lurked around in a particular area, and now he's going to flee further. Now that he's received word from Jonathan saying, yes, Saul is definitely my father is definitely out to get you. You got to go, bro. So David leaves, and so he makes a stop in Nob. This is where you get into the beginning of chapter 21, and he gets some things from Ahimelech, who's the priest there, namely some food, and which in the text ends up being the showbread, and Goliath's sword, because he says because David said, hey, I'm unarmed because of the haste of where I'm going and the orders that I've been given. David kind of made up a story that the king is sending him on a mission or whatever. And because of the haste, I left without weapons. Do you have something here for me? And he says that I have the sword of Goliath, the giant that you killed. So he takes the sword, and that's, he's, kind of goes and leaves with that. And so with that, what you have here, starting in verse 10, this is the text that you see, here that follows all of that as David continues to be on the run. And take note of where he runs to. Verse 10, it says, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Okay, now Gath is one of the 5 major cities in Philistia. So David has fled to Philistine territory. That's where he's gone, right? Now, one of the things, if you remember, when we looked at Psalm 59, you kind of saw a situation where David saw enemies on 2 fronts, one on the inside and one on the outside. The inside being from Saul himself, and then on the outside, the Philistines, because David was still actively fighting the Philistines and that sort of thing. But in the way that they are going after David and seeking to kill him, it's almost as if, and again, given the plot that Saul had against David, it's almost as if they were kind of conspiring together, even though they didn't directly interface. So they're kind of on the same category as far as David's enemies are concerned. But I mean, even though that is the case, though, it's interesting that David flees to Gath, which isn't necessarily friendly territory or anything like that. But I mean, I guess it's something where David feels that Gath in Philistine territory is a safer territory than it is in Israel, with Saul seeking to kill him. And whatnot. This isn't the only time you're going to see David kind of cozy up with the Philistines or be in Philistine territory. You see that later on down the road in the narrative here. We don't need to get into that now or anything, but that's kind of what you have. Now, it's not, this isn't anything where David comes in, and I don't think this is a matter of him identifying himself as David or identifying himself as the one who had been the commander of the armies of Israel. I mean, I don't think that's what you're dealing with here there at all. You kind of get the sense that David is, when you go through the narrative here a little bit more, you get the sense that he's discovered, his identity is discovered, which is kind of interesting given the times, because I mean, it's not like David is known from several news broadcasts where you see him on Facebook and X and that sort of thing. You didn't have those things back then. But however way he was discovered, I mean, is not known to us. But what we know is that he is discovered to be, the commander of the armies of Israel. And whatnot. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. Let me just go ahead and again read the text here, where it says, "And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, 'Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s.' And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, 'Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?'" So that's kind of that's the text that you have there, and then and that's the end of the chapter 21. And then in chapter 22, it's it talks about David departed from there. So that's what you're dealing with, and that's the text that's surrounding Psalm 34 and Psalm 56, and so. Like I said, Psalm 56 is what we're going to look at today. And so the title and the label that's there on Psalm 56, it says, "To the choir master according to the dove on the far off terebinths," which that may have been a song that had a particular tune. And so this is its way of saying that this Psalm 56 here, goes with that tune of that particular song. It's identified as a miktam, which could have been a liturgical form of the song or whatever, of David. And then it says, "When the Philistines seized him in Gath," and I emphasize that term, seized him, because you may or may not get that sense in the actual narrative in 1 Samuel 21. There, it doesn't say, "Hey, these men seized David" or whatever. But I mean, let me just tell you what I believe is going on here with all of this. So again, you notice here that at the beginning of the narrative here, in verse, let's see, I lost my place here. Yeah, in verse 10, "And David rose and fled that day from Saul." So he's on the run. He's fleeing from Saul, "and went to Achish, the king of Gath." Now, when it says that David went to Achish, the king of Gath, you can look at that as either something where that's a direct, literal sort of explanation there, as in David actually presents himself to Achish. What he would have said there, who knows? But I mean, you get, from later on, what you see next in the text, it wouldn't have been a matter of him saying that, "Hey, I'm David and I'm seeking a place to hide," or that sort of thing. But you could look at it along those lines. But probably more likely what you're dealing with here is when it's saying that, "And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath." That's the text way of saying that, not saying that he went and actually went face to face with Achish originally at that time, but he went to the land that Achish, oversaw. In Gath is the other way of understanding that. So going to the land of a particular king would be on par with, "I went to the king," or that sort of thing. And that's kind of more likely what you're dealing with. So this is just another way of the narrative saying that he fled to Gath, which was ruled by this man, Achish, who was king over Gath at that time. Now, his servants there, in whatever way and however way they did this, suspected that this was not just some random Israelite who's taking up residence in the land. However way they find out, they discover that this is David. So, David, they would know him as one who's gone out on military campaigns against the Philistines and being highly successful at it. So this wouldn't have been a good look for David. I mean, to be trouncing around in their land, and that sort of thing. And so in verse 11, it says, and the servants of Achish said to him, so actually said to Achish, is not this David, the king of the land? So, I mean, if they're, noticing that David is taking up residence there, and then, they suspect something, they go to the king and says, there's this guy, is this not David? As they hold up his photograph to the king. No, just kidding. They wouldn't have had a photograph, but is not this, and the service, is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul had struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. So you remember that is something that we first saw in chapter 18, after David had killed Goliath, which, by the way, David is going into Gath, which was Goliath's hometown, with the sword of Goliath, So, again, all of these things that are discovered, and that may have been one of the things that may have tipped these guys off that this is actually David, is that he's in possession of Goliath's sword. That may have been what tipped them off, come to think of it. But I mean, David had gotten Goliath's sword when he visited Ahimelech in the previous passage. Now he's in Gath. And so you have these servants saying, and they're familiar with the dances and the words of the people that were saying that they were saying there. Saul had struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. So they understand, how mighty that someone like David is. And so they wouldn't be ones who would want to sit by and let him run around and roam free and that sort of thing. I think their attitude was, we have to do something with this guy. Now, David catches wind of this, obviously, because it says there in verse 12, it says, and David took these words to heart. And so he understands, he knows that this is what the people, that at least Achish's servants, are saying, and they're saying this to the king. And so it says in verse 12, and David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath, because if Achish is receiving this information from his servants, and Achish takes this to heart, then Achish is going to say, yeah, you guys are right. Get him, seize him, get rid of him. And by get rid of him, we're talking about kill him, not necessarily banish him or that sort of thing. I think that's what David is predicting would happen. So David's strategy there, if you see in verse 13, it says, and he changed, so he changed its behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gates and let his spittle run down his beard. So he's acting like a crazy person. He's acting like a madman, with the thought of, this person who is perceived to be insane couldn't possibly be the same person that was leading Israel, number one, against Goliath, with the one who killed Goliath, and number two, a mighty warrior who's gone out in these battles against the Philistines and has been successful, so that people are keep singing these songs. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. The whole idea would be for them to look at him, and Achish especially, and say, do you really think that this would be the man that would be responsible for all of this guy who's clearly crazy? And that's what Achish's attitude is. And I think what you have here, because again, in Psalm 56, the introduction there, again, it says when the Philistines seized him in Gath. So I think what the idea is that you did actually have the servants and other people seize David and bring him forward to Achish, with the thought of, This is the guy of whom there's, the king of the land, of whom they sing, Saul is struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s. And so with David, with the strategy that he has of acting like a madman, he's one who's wanting to out of character so that Achish, because he's afraid of Achish, so that Achish doesn't take that to heart and say, okay, you guys are right, kill him. And so it works, because what you see here in the following verses here in verses 14 and 15, it says, then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man is mad. So it's almost as if he's saying, you guys have suggested to me that this was the man of whom they say Saul has struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. In other words, you see him, this is the mighty warrior, the king of the land, who's probably up to no good, who's in this land of Gath right now. This is who you presented him to be. Now you've seized him and brought him to me. You can clearly see that he's mad. You can clearly see that he's insane. So you can start to see that David's strategy here is working, because Achish is one he's saying, behold. In other words, he's saying, look upon this. I mean, it's the stress of saying, look at him. Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen? I love that phrase, because I don't remember what translation it was, but there's one translation. It might be the NIV. I don't know, either the present version of the NIV or even the 1984 version of it, or the 2011, whatever, where it's worded saying that, am I in shortage of madmen that you've brought him to me? And it's just the way that that's termed is just funny. It makes me laugh a little bit. But here in my ESV, it says, do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? You want to bring this crazy person into my house? No, thank you. So Achish sees him not as what his servants have pegged him as the actual David, the king of the land, of whom everybody's singing his praises, of being a mighty warrior. But he's saying, no, this is, you clearly see that this is a madman. This is not the same person that you suspect him to be. So that's what you have here. That's what David wanted to accomplish, mission accomplished, and that sort of thing. And so when he's seized, and maybe by seized, there's like they seized him and then maybe they kept him in holding for a little bit, or that sort of thing before presenting him to the king or whatever. And then so David had this psalm in mind to, either at that time or maybe a little bit later, to compose, regarding all this, things surrounding this. Now, one of the things that I've read, and I don't know how widespread this is that when it comes to this whole thing of David acting insane, you get a sense that that you're dealing with David who's acting in a way as if to demonstrate a lack of faith or a lack of trust in God. If he had trusted God, then he wouldn't have felt the need to act like an insane person, is the criticism that David might get. I know that I've read that in one or two places. And I get where people might think that, but when you look at the Psalms that surround this narrative, you don't get the sense that this is somebody who lacks faith or trust in God. And this is especially what you get when you look at Psalm 56. You get the same sense, in Psalm 34 in a few places. But even here in Psalm 56, you definitely get the sense that you're dealing with a guy in the moment, who it has his full trust in God, even when he's afraid. So here's what I want to do. And again, we're looking at Psalm 56 before Psalm 34, which we'll look at next time, because this is a shorter of the two. So taking some time to look at the narrative background, and then looking at the shorter of the two Psalms, I think is a little bit appropriate here. But in Psalm 56, let me just go ahead and read the Psalm altogether. It's 13 verses here. Where this is David speaking. He says, "Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me all day long. An attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long. For many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings. Having trouble reading. I'm sorry. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. Okay? So there we have, Psalm 56. And so the way that so hopefully when I read through that, you saw, the different places, the few places where he says, in God I trust. That seems to be the theme of this psalm, in God I trust. So in the midst of this situation, we have David confessing his trust in God. But, other noteworthy things to note here, we'll get to that. But I mean, this psalm, starts out in a way that's not too unfamiliar with other psalms that you might see this, where he says, be gracious to me, O God. It's kind of another way of asking for deliverance and the grace of God coming to his rescue. He's saying, be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long, an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. So, and here's the thing, while the what surrounds this psalm is what goes on with David when he's in Gath, which is in the land of the Philistines. Also keep in mind, though, that, this is fresh off the heels of him escaping Saul, and going out of Israel territory to go into enemy territory, essentially. So, not only has he had to deal with things on the home front, not necessarily with Israel all around. Again, David had a fan club in Israel as well. But I mean, even with Saul and his servants that he sends to kill him and that sort of thing, he's had to deal with that on what's supposed to be friendly territory. And now, coming here and him being seized by the Philistines, it's just like he's getting this attack on both sides. And so I think no wonder, he's one who says not only about being trampled by men, but he says all day long, an attacker oppresses me. It's almost as if he says, I can't escape. There's no respite, it seems like, when it comes to this, whether I'm at home or whether I'm away. There's always somebody that seems to be seeking my life. So all day long, an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. So in their pride, and this was definitely true for Saul. And I know that Saul isn't the focus when it comes to this psalm here, but I mean, again, David has had to deal with that too. And then coming here, these are foreign enemies who raise themselves up in pride, and thinking that they are ones who are now in a position to overcome and overtake this man and do with him what they think that he deserves. And so, all of this, just showing all the more just the enemies that David is gathering around him, and David looking, and not of any fault of David, by the way. That's not to say that, because some people can gain enemies and it's because of how that person is acting and behaving. But that's not the case with David, out of no fault of his own or anything that he's done. Now, with the Philistines, perhaps you could say it's a little bit more understandable because you're dealing with warring parties here. The Israel and the Philistines are not friends or anything like that. But nevertheless, as a member of the covenant people of Israel, David still is in a position to seek the appeal to God as a member of that covenant people and saying, please protect me from these people. These are people, by the way. I mean, this just came to me, and it's interesting now, even just thinking now that David's in Gath. Remember, when he faced Goliath, or was looking to face Goliath in chapter 17, one of the things that he says is, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of the living God? So that's the statement from somebody who realizes and recognizes that when an enemy rises up against God's people, and again, we're assuming that this isn't something that God is raising up as a punishment against Israel for worshiping other gods or that sort of thing. But these are enemies that are going up against the covenant people of Israel. David is one who's saying, this is an uncircumcised fellow here. He doesn't have any cause to come here and defy the armies of the living God. And so with the confidence that he has, plus with his experience of killing lions and bears, he feels boldened to go up against Goliath and that sort of thing. It's interesting, though, that you have that, but you have David, as it says in the text there, it says that he was afraid of Achish, who wasn't a giant, right? So it's just interesting, and that's something I want to touch upon here in just a second here about David's fear. But there you get the sense of this is something that has happened all day long, and so surrounded by these people, which as it says here, that these are people that have seized him when he was at Gath. Now, when it comes to verse 3, this is where it talks about. He says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." Now, as the text said in 1 Samuel 21, when Achish's servants were saying, "Isn't this David, the king of the land?" David took this to heart, and he was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. That's what the text says. And so here you have this whole thing of, when I am afraid, I put my trust in him. Now, what I want to say here is that it can be natural and okay to feel the emotion of fear. And I say that is because I think some people assign fear in any and every circumstance as something that equals lack of faith and lack of trust in God. And that's not necessarily the case. It can be there's something to be said about when we become afraid and then we let that fear overtake us, so that trust in God is just thrown out the window and we don't put our faith and our trust in God. But I mean, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to say in every single situation, that, you're afraid. So if somebody's afraid of something, they say, why aren't you trusting in God? You have to understand maybe what's going on in the particular context. So, I mean, even in a modern day sense, if you're sleeping in your house and you hear the so-called bump in the night, that might give an indication that somebody's broken into your house. I'm going to guess that you are going to be at least a little bit afraid that somebody has broken into your house. And if you tell the account later on, nobody's going to fault you for that. Nobody's going to say, why didn't you trust God? What are you doing being afraid, or that sort of thing? That's not, so, I mean, I want to establish this because, I think there can be a tendency for false humility where some people will say, I wasn't afraid of this, and fear is just an indication of lack of trust in God and blah, 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 blah. And listen, it certainly can be, but we have to look at the situation at hand here. And David is one who admits that he gets afraid. We see in the text of 1 Samuel 21 that he was afraid of the king. Now, what do we see David doing with that fear? Do we see him descending into something where he starts operating in the flesh? Again, some people might say that that's what he did when it came to him starting to act insane and that sort of thing. But I just find it interesting, though, and you will even see hints of this in Psalm 34, that he talks about his trust in God. even after he's been seized by these Philistines in Gath. But he's one who admits, when I am afraid. And I don't think he's necessarily saying when I am afraid in this situation. I mean, it does apply there, but I mean, he's one who talks all around. This is like whenever I'm afraid. So he does admit, David is somebody who does become afraid. All right. So if you're one who says, yeah, I've been afraid in this situation or this situation, you're in good company. Okay. David has been one who's been in situations that have made him afraid. And the immediate surrounding context and background, you see him being afraid of Achish, right? But what do we see David doing? This is the key point here, and it's because of this key point, and we see what David does in this situation that we see a reversal here of his fear state. So it says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you." He's saying this to God in the second person. I trust in you. Okay. That's what I do. That's what I do when I am afraid. When I'm in that fear state, this is what I do. I put my trust in you. You can maybe put it in another way, saying, I give the situation to you. I entrust myself to you. I put myself in your hand, whatever the case might be. I trust in you. And there's no better person to put your trust in than God himself, the God of the universe, the all-powerful, omnipotent God, right? I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. So you see the reversal there? Now that you put your trust in the most reliable source that there is, in the person of God himself, who again, by the way, is somebody who's in covenant relationship with David, right? That's who he puts his trust in. And he says, in God. Now listen, in verse 4, where I just read a second ago, in God, whose word I praise. Now, what does he mean by his word there? Now, we think of word, and we automatically think the Bible, and we think scripture. And that is the case. Of course, we have to understand that the whole Bible wasn't compiled yet at this time, but there is a certain element of scripture. And if we're talking about anything of scripture, obviously, I think mainly and largely what you're dealing with are things like the Pentateuch and that sort of thing, where the promises of God are fully laid out as it relates to his covenant people. And even with the specific word that God gives to David that might surround his promises and that sort of thing, not only his promises, but also the revelation of God as far as who he is. Remember what we said last time when we were looking at Psalm 59, and the confidence that David exhibits in there is based on who God is. That's where that confidence comes from. And that's the same thing that you can think here as it relates to David putting his trust in God. When he puts his trust in God, he thinks about his word, and you can just sum that up into what God has revealed about himself and what he's revealed about his promises to Israel altogether, and maybe even to David specifically, because again, the kingship of Israel has been promised to David. And that's what you're dealing with there. So you can look at it in a couple different ways, but this is a word that David says, I praise the word of God. In other words, that's just a way of saying, I hear what God has said and what he has spoken, and I uplift it. I trust it as true is another way of that you can look at that and what he's communicating there. So he says in verse 4, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. So you see there, David says, I am afraid. And when I get afraid, I put my trust in you, Lord. And then, and then he says, and then he starts talking in the third person, in God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. So you see this going back and forth from third person to second person and vice versa and that sort of thing. We even saw that, I believe, a little bit in Psalm 59 when we looked at that last time. But when you have your trust in the right source, when you have your trust in the right source, that can do a great deal as it relates to, whatever fear that you might have. So it's not as a matter of the fact of, oh, you have fear, therefore you have lack of trust. It's like, we get afraid in certain situations, given certain circumstances around that are surrounding us. But what David does is when I'm afraid, I know where to go and I know who to put my trust in. I trust in you. And that trust, again, goes to his word that whom I praise. And that's a good thing for us, by the way. What are the promises that are laid forth for us, that are laid forth in Scripture? This is a reason why being familiar with Scripture is so important. Because if we're not familiar with Scripture, we're not familiar with the promises that are made and that are afforded to us, and we're not familiar with who God is and what he's revealed himself to be, we don't have that understanding, then it's very easy for us to get bogged down with fear and not put that trust in God as we should. But David is one who can put his faith and his trust in God because he understands the promises of God and he understands who God is. And that's why he can say, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. So you see how that affects the fear state that he was in before. And then what is tagged there at the end of verse 4, what can flesh do to me? Now, what are we dealing with, and what's David dealing with specifically in this situation in 1 Samuel 21? Flesh, right? What can flesh do to me? Now, we look at something like this, though, and the question is asked, what can flesh do to me? We might think, well, flesh can do a great deal to me. If flesh can't do anything to God's people, then you wouldn't have martyrs, but you have martyrs who die for the Christian faith and that sort of thing. So doesn't it seem like that flesh can do a lot of things? In a physical sense, yes, but it's not simply just a matter of what can be done outwardly and that sort of thing. Of course, God can bring physical deliverance and whatnot, but one of the things that we have to understand is that we're not dealing with a God who, if things happen to his people, that it's done outside of his purposes and, just kind of something where, whoops, something just slipped by God and he didn't see it coming. And so, the protective hand of God went slack there for like 2 seconds and evil men were able to get their hands on us and that sort of thing. No, if you understand that in everything you are you're in the sovereign protective hand of God, sovereign, let me emphasize that word, then that really just kind of should change our thinking as well. So here's the thing. You might be familiar with this passage, but in Matthew chapter 10, the words of Jesus, and in, let's see here, in verse, I'm going to start in verse 26. Verse 26 of Matthew 10. So have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And do not fear those. Here's where I really want you to put your concentration. Verse 28 and following. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. So even if somebody is able to do something to you, they can't do anything to your soul, which really counts. If your soul is right with God, regenerated, and whatnot, then they can't do anything about that, and you'd be with the Lord. Doesn't mean that it's inappropriate necessarily to be afraid that somebody will kill you, but like one of the things is that fearing people who can, it's a matter of putting things into perspective. Do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. If they were ones who could kill the soul, yeah, and then there would be definite justification in being afraid of them. But Jesus here is saying they can't touch what matters the most here, right? But listen to what he goes on to say. Let's see. It's saying, do not fear the one who killed those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? In other words, even when it comes to cheap birds, members of God's created order, animals of God's created order, not one of them will fall to the ground. Not one of them will drop dead apart from the will of the Father. That's really what's being laid forth there. So if God has that much care and concern and control over cheap birds, then what does that say for us, right? That's the whole point. That's the whole idea. And then he says, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. One of the things that you see in different parts of Scripture, you even see this in the Old Testament, even I think in a couple of areas in David's narrative, where it talks about not one hair falling to the ground. That was an illustrative way. That was a figure of speech to talk about somebody coming to harm or destruction or that sort of thing. And I think in a certain sense that Jesus is using this here when he's saying that even the very hairs of your head are all numbered, is like in an indirect way saying not one of them is going to fall to the ground apart from me, So, I mean, if anything does happen, it's not a matter of just some sort of accident that happened apart from the hand of God, and if we understand and we have faith that all the purposes of God are perfect in every way, then really, even if somebody is able to lay their hands on us, we understand that God's sovereign plan is perfect, and that He has a worthwhile purpose in it, and that can do something as far as the level of fear that we may or may not have, right? In a positive sense. So it says, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Okay. So we already know, and even just from the words of Jesus himself, what kind of value he puts on on us as people. We're worth more than many sparrows, and yet he pays that much close attention to sparrows, and not one of them falls to the ground. It's interesting. It's like, I was walking downtown in town the other day, and walking down the sidewalk, I saw, a dead bird, and I don't know the cause of that bird's demise, right? But I mean, you're walking by, and there's this bird lying there dead, and I think all of us have come upon dead birds before. That the death of that bird didn't happen outside of the will of God. Isn't that amazing? I mean, we pass by stuff like that, and we just think, we even think much of it. But Jesus is one who says even the falling of cheap birds doesn't happen apart from the Father, right? So when we ask the question, going back to Psalm 56, what can flesh do to me? I think the way that we can look at it is saying, what can flesh do to me that overrides or overthrows the original plan of God? And in David's case, we already know what David's original plan is. God's original plan for David, is that he become the king of Israel, right? And so when he's afraid, he puts his trust in God. He wraps his mind around the promises of God, and then he says, "In God I trust. What can flesh do to me?" That's the realization that he comes to, the paradigm shift that he has in his mind that helps him gain, let's say, some stability in this whole thing, even though he has felt fear in this, in all of this, right? We continue on in verse 5. It says, all day long. There's that term again. So again, this whole thing of, David has felt like this surrounding attack from all sides here, continuously. All day long they injure my cause. Some translations say they twist my words, or they flip-flop my words, or something along those lines. The way that the Hebrew is, it could have that sort of meaning or understanding to that, which is very much possible. And if you understand, the whole thing of how they're able to quote the whole thing of Saul is struck down as thousands and David is tens of thousands, is that something that they would have used to their own advantage, maybe perhaps twisting at least maybe what the understanding of those words would be, and saying of David, David's coming here with this intention, now that his head is full of pride, with all these songs, coming in here and thinking that he can do something adverse to us here in the land of Gath, or that's just speculation. But again, that could be a possibility of what it might look like if we're talking about words that are being twisted or that sort of thing. And in a very same way, I mean, in an indirect way, you could say that is an attack on his cause, because his cause is really just to escape danger, and specifically from Saul. But nevertheless, he says, All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. Now, notice what he goes on to say. Notice if this sounds familiar. They stir up strife. They lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. What does that sound like? Didn't we just get done seeing David describe that? I mean, that being described of David, but even kind of David kind of hinting to that when he looked at Psalm 59. There, the context was Saul going against David. Here, the context is the Philistines. And, this is just speculation, maybe filling in the blanks of what might have happened. Again, this is what we see here in Psalm 56 is in the wake of David being seized by the Philistines in Gath. Was it a situation where before that happened, and even with the suspicions that were rising up and them talking to King Achish, that they were keeping a very close watch and eye on him and lurking for him and stirring up strife against him? I mean, stirring up strife. I mean, that's what they were doing. That's what the servants were doing. And when they were saying what they were saying to King Achish, right? And all those things. So you kind of have a similar situation. And even this whole thing of waiting to kill him, or, and that sort of thing, as it says there, let's see, where was it? They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. Now we know that that's what happened with King Saul against David. Is there a similar situation, perhaps unrecorded in scripture, where you kind of see a similar thing happening in Gath? Yeah, it's possible. But it's just interesting. You see that these are very familiar words and very familiar happenings. No wonder, just to repeat again, no wonder David is one who says, all day long I have to deal with this, right? Because he's getting it from both sides, and that sort of thing. Now, when you continue there in verse 7, it says, for their crime will they escape. Now, this is interesting because there are other translations that have something that's very different here. And it's I think it's something along the lines of, because of their wickedness, cast them out or cast them forth or something like that. Which way is the more appropriate translation of that? Maybe it could be a situation where there's a similarity in a Hebrew word or a phrase or something like that, where it's translated one way and not the other. That sort of thing. I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, it's this whole thing of the alternative reading of that, because of their wickedness, cast them out. Which might be a possible reading, as opposed to, at least what I have here, for their crime will they escape. Which, I mean, if you look at it in that way, this question that kind of is arisen, where in an indirect way you kind of have David appealing to God for them to be cast out. So in a similar way, whether you look at the two readings, you can maybe make an argument that it's geared towards the same thing. But I think there's a case to be made for the reading where it says, because of wickedness, cast them out or cast them forth, because of what's said there in the next clause there of verse 7, in wrath, cast down the peoples, O God. Okay, cast down the peoples, oh God. And again, I don't think this is a situation where, if we're looking at peoples and interpreting that as people who are outside of the covenant community of Israel, just some sort of indiscriminate sort of thing where we just kind of anybody who's not an Israelite, cast them down, or that sort of thing. Remember, again, a similar appeal that's made in Psalm 59, where the other clause that's attached to this whole thing of bringing down people of the nations is that those who plot evil or treachery or that sort of thing was kind of, I think, the words that were used in that context. And what you have here, of what we understand that the situation is, people plotting, people outside of the covenant community who are plotting against David, plotting against a member of that covenant community, right? And so that's what you have there. So I think that's what goes into that. And it might be something where David is saying, with these Philistines and other peoples of the nations that have the same thing in mind, whether it's of me individually or of your people overall, cast them out and bring them down, that sort of thing. And that might be what you're dealing with there. Verse 8, you have kept count of my tossings. Some translations say wanderings. If we're talking about tossings here, I think the idea is the whole idea of tossings in bed, which gives you this understanding of somebody who, because they're distressed, are having trouble sleeping. And, maybe you've been there, whether it's a result of being under distress or pressure or not. Many of us, I'm sure, at some point or another, understand what it is to not be able to sleep, and you toss and you turn and that sort of thing. If we're talking about wanderings, I think the whole idea, whether you're talking about tossings or wanderings, is this sense of restlessness. And when we're talking about wanderings, and even if we're looking at wanderings from a literal perspective, where David is wandering from here to here to here in an attempt to escape danger, this is something where, David is one who is acknowledging and saying that you have kept count of my wanderings. Kept count. That indicates a God who is intimately involved and intimately knowledgeable of where David is, okay, and what his situation is. And isn't that something that we would want for God, for the God that we serve, for somebody who is aware of our situation? Isn't it much more comforting to know that that nothing is escaping God's view here, okay? And that he's watchful over everything, as opposed to, a God where, maybe he doesn't see. And from a literary standpoint, you see this in the Psalms where, it is worded where it's like, God, don't you see what they're looking at here? We kind of looked at a little semblance of that last time when we were looking at Psalm 59, right? But really, at the end of the day, you're dealing with somebody who knows and who understands that nothing escapes God's view here. And as it relates to David's situation, who again is seized in Gath, or is in danger, at least to the point where, even before being seized, that he's had to act like a crazy person. This is something David acknowledges, and not only just that, but just even in any other situation where there's pressure, where there's trouble and that sort of thing. David is one who says, you're aware of those things. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? So the whole idea here is that, you have knowledge of all of these things. The request of put my tears in your bottle is along the lines of, keep track of, just how many tears that I shed, so that you understand and that the distress that I've been in and how much that's affected me, how much that all of this has distressed me. And even though that's a request, it's worded as a request there, put my tears in your bottle, there's still an acknowledgement in the clause right after that indicates that that David understands he's dealing with a God who understands all of this anyway. Are they not in your book? In other words, all of my tossings, all of my weeping and those sorts of things, they're in your book. And the way that we understand this whole thing of book is that this is a book that is, it's being kept as a record. Let's call it a heavenly record, or as some places might say, as it relates to book. I think a good comparison would come from Malachi 3. I think the verse is 16, where there's a reference of a book of remembrance. I think it kind of goes perhaps along those same lines, where this is all on the record of how distressed I have been. As it relates to all of this and all other sorts of things. You are very much aware of all of this. And to the point where, I can say to you with confidence, keep my tears in a jar or in a bottle. The whole idea with that might be actual, in the form of a wineskin or something like that. Some sort of container where the idea is God knows where you are. God is aware. He understands these things, right? And just to kind of pops up in my mind. I mean, just kind of not only just having this thought of God who, be aware of my distress and things like that. If we look at things from a New Testament perspective and we understand, Christ coming down in the form of a man, fully God and fully man. And if we understand what the book of Hebrews has said about that, how God in human flesh in the person of Jesus Christ has experienced our experiences and suffered the things that we've suffered, he can one who can serve as a perfect and faithful high priest because of those things. So we definitely know, even from a New Testament perspective, that we have a God who understands our plight, not only the specifics of the circumstances that we go through, but what that's like to be in those situations, because Jesus Christ himself, God in human flesh, has been there. And because of that, and because of other things as well, not only because of that, but because of that, he can serve as the perfect and faithful high priest that we have right now, sitting at the right hand in the heavens. So it's just something to latch on to, just even something from that we can take further from our perspective, understanding Jesus Christ and who he is to us now. Let's see, are they not in your book? Verse 9, then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. Okay. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? So that last part there of what I just read there is what we looked at before, about, he's reemphasizing his trust in God, but go back a little bit, because again, he talks about his enemies, how his enemies will turn back. This again is something that comes from the confidence of David, knowing that God knows his situation, and understanding that God is not going to just sit by unnecessarily or do anything or turn his head that isn't a part of God's will, and that sort of thing. And that, that God has David's protection in mind. Because God is knowledgeable of all these things, that he's knowledgeable of all the things as it relates to David's distress. It's all written in his book. He says, he's able to say confidently here in verse 9, then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. In the day when I call, my enemies will turn back. All right. As it says there, as I just read there, this I know, that, or some translations say because God is for me, and that's just a wonderful thing. Just think about that. Just the fact that the God of the universe, David is saying that the God of the universe is for me. And guess what? He is for you as well. He's for me and he's for you as well. How do I know that? Romans 8. Through Jesus Christ, God is for us. If God is for us, who can be against us? That's Paul in Romans 8. So God is for us as well. That's a wonderful truth, and that's a wonderful thing to meditate on. God is not against you. He is for you. You are his child. Think of anybody who's a child of anybody else. If we're talking about a normal, regular, relationship between a child and their parents or that sort of thing, under normal circumstances, because I understand this isn't always the case, unfortunately. But in the natural thing of what we would expect from parent to child and that sort of thing, the parents are for their children, right? We are children of God through Jesus Christ. He is for his children. He is for his sons and daughters, right? So we can say that with confidence, because that's what Scripture says. David is one who can speak confidently with this, is saying, because God is for me. Verse 10, in God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? So there you see the equivalency of man and flesh, because it was saying, what can flesh do to me in verse 4? And that's not anything surprising or anything like that. He's essentially saying the same thing. So one thing I do want to point out, though, with this is that where he says, in God whose word, in God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise. So he repeats the same thing, but he uses two different words words for God. In God, whose word I praise, that's Elohim. So he's talking about the in that word, in the Judaistic way that we understand that word, is like it's really a way of recognizing and acknowledging the one true Almighty God. Even though the word Elohim, the im at the end, is seen as, in a sense, of a plural, singularly from Hebrew scripture, that's always a singular understanding to that. In God, the one singular God, not any other God, not not the God of this nation or that people or that sort of thing. The one true Almighty God that David and all of Israel have covenant relationship with. In Elohim, whose word I praise. We talked about that before. In the Lord, and that's Yahweh or Jehovah. That's mentioned there. So that focuses on the covenant, the covenant nature of everything. In the Lord, whose word I praise. So notice there's the connection there between, and this shouldn't be surprising, but the connection between Elohim and Jehovah or Yahweh. So Yahweh is Elohim, Elohim is Yahweh, and it's just a way of acknowledging that the covenant God that we're talking about here is the one true God, and that's the only true God that I can put my trust in, and whose word that I can praise and exalt and uplift, because I cling to his promises and what he's revealed and that sort of thing. And then he goes back to in verse 11, in God, in Elohim, I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Right. So that just again shows us again, how our perspective of fear and our emotion of fear is affected in a positive sense when we put our trust in the right person and put it in the right place. Verse 12, I must perform my vows to you, O God. The vows, the promises that David has made in making a vow, which vows, when they're made, they're expected to be kept and that sort of thing. You get a sense that these vows that David is referring to, there are vows that he's made as it relates to, asking God for protection and that sort of thing. And you see how the vows are to be met, where he says, I will render thank offerings to you. Right. So it's in the form of offerings, and specifically thank offerings. So is this somebody who understands that, when I get that deliverance, and that sort of thing, I'm quick to give thanks to you. And that's the worship that I extend to you as part of the vow that I made to you as it relates to all of this. Right. So that's what we're dealing with. I must perform. So again, that shows again the importance of keeping the vows there. I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. Verse 13, for you have delivered my soul from death. There it is. Because again, as I said, and as I suggest, it's in connection to the deliverance that God has enacted on behalf of David. You have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk. No, notice that I may walk before God in the light of life. So you see the difference there. He's been delivered. His soul has been delivered from death, and he lives in the light of life. So there's not death. There's life. God has preserved his life. Now, here's the thing, and you might have heard me emphasize this, that middle part there of that last verse there in verse 13, that I may walk before God in the light of life. In other words, and what I want to point out here is that this is not simply just a matter of please save my life, and then when my life is saved, I'm asking for the preservation of my life just for the sake of preservation of my life. That's not what we're dealing with David. David is one who's crying out to God and wanting God to preserve his life, and then when God does that, there's that preservation so that David can continue in life. Why? That I may walk before God. In other words, that my life that's been preserved in the light of life may be filled with walking in your presence according to your will, and with opportunities to worship you while I'm still here, all those sorts of things. This isn't a matter of some sort of fleshly, carnal, or even like, what some unbelievers might have, who maybe are agnostic and they've come upon a very, lethal illness or something like that, and they might pray, "Oh God, if you get me out of this, I promise I'll live for you all the days of my life." Which seems to indicate, and a lot of times that might come from people who weren't walking with God before, and that's obvious if we're talking about an unbeliever. That's different from David's situation, because David has been walking according to the Lord even up to this point. But even there, if God, let's say hypothetically, God can do whatever he wants. But let's say, like, to make testimony of himself, heals this person of their disease. What are the chances that some of those people will go right back to what they were doing before? Now, I can't say for sure, because God might use that situation to regenerate that person's heart and bring them to a true understanding, a true knowledge of Jesus Christ for salvation. But in other cases where that isn't the case, and let's say that they get well from their illness, they go right back to what they were doing before. Their whole thing was preserve my life for the sake of preserving my life. That's not what David is looking for here. So even when it comes to preservation of his life, it's not just preservation of life for the sake of preservation of life. Although, I don't think we would blame David for having that mindset if he did have it. But it's just noteworthy to look at the deeper essence of this and saying that, where the whole thing is, as he lays forth there, is that that I may walk before God in the light of life. So his life that he lives, that's been preserved, is not for his own purpose, for his own, so I can do what I want, and so I can fill my life with what I want to do, and for my will and that sort of thing. No, his whole thing, that I might walk before God, that I might walk before you. And there's so many things that could go into that. Again, like I said, living according to the will of God, living for his praise, honor, and glory, and that sort of thing. So God isn't left in the dust and left in the rearview mirror once God preserves his life. He's like, okay, thanks, God, and then I'm going to go about my own way. Really, what you can say, if we're familiar with David's life, and we're familiar with David's life through the Psalms and through the narratives, this is an appeal to a continuation of what David has been doing and living before God in the light of life. Not something that he begins to do, right? But that's, I think, how we should look at this. And so we get in the heart of David, not only somebody who trusts in God, who lifts up his word in praise, and then is one who is able to stand confidently without fear now that he puts his trust in the right place. But now that when he calls upon the Lord and the Lord delivers him, he has the full intention of continuing on to do what he's always done up to this point, and that's living before God in the light of life. Okay. So really a great example of our perspective in our minds and our heart, and how that should transform and transfer into our hands and our feet. In other words, the way that we live as well, always having this understanding that everything that we do is before the Lord as we walk in the light of life. That's what our perspective should always be, day in and day out, whether we're in distress or whether we're not, right? And so that's the whole thing. And so that's how David saw himself through. That was the perspective that he was having when he was in Gath, and as he was seized in Gath, when he's facing this whole situation. He's been surrounded by many people, many enemies, and that sort of thing. And he looks for deliverance, and he will get deliverance, and he sings of deliverance and that sort of thing. But he continues to do what he's always done up to this point. And by the way, that should show us something, because even with the distress that David has gone through, it's not a matter of David saying, God, where were you on that one? I don't think I can trust you after this point, right? This is something where the faith and the strength and everything that he gets from God is going to continue just as it did before. And what David is going through here, as hard as that is not going to keep him from doing what he's been doing all along. And again, when he says, when I am afraid, I mean, he's talking not only of this situation, although this would apply with his situation in Gath, but what he experiences whenever he's afraid. What does he do? He puts his trust in God. He's not one who's like, I keep going through all these things. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. It's a perpetual living out of trust in God that doesn't waver or doesn't fall or doesn't slip. I'm not saying that that can't happen or that there hasn't been a temptation of that happening. There may have been situations like that with David. We know that that's been the case with Asaph, right? We looked at that. What was it, a few weeks ago when we were looking at Psalm 73? Now that was a psalm where Asaph was giving his testimony, saying, "I almost slipped, but God helped me in bringing me perspective as I went into His presence," and that sort of thing. So all of this is to say, when you're in distress, when there is fear, and fear does come up, don't pretend that you never get afraid of anything. Put your trust in God, and that changes your perspective on the fear that you have, okay? And that's something that David saw over and over again in his life, and I would say even in the situation that he was in when he was in Gath, right? So hopefully some good things that you've been able to gather into your hearts and your minds and things to meditate on. And so that's where we'll leave things for now as it relates to this situation with David. Now, again, the other psalm that's attached to this situation with David and Gath from 1 Samuel 21 is Psalm 34, and that's what we're going to look at next time. But for right now, we finished Psalm 56, so we'll leave things there for now. Hopefully this has been truly a blessing for you. And hopefully you take a lot of what we've looked at in this episode to heart. If you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, again, let me remind you to go ahead and follow and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to this podcast. Follow me on X. Again, the handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also be sure to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End, What Jesus Taught His Disciples in the Olivet Discourse. The Olivet Discourse, by the way, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Answering the question about what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the age. Not a book. Let me just remind once again for the billionth time that this is not a book that centers on sensationalism or date setting of any sort or headline prophecy. This is an examination of the text itself, coming to an understanding of it, understanding how the disciples would have understood Jesus' words, how we can understand those words today by extension, looking at and just, how that affects our look at other eschatological passages as well, having to do with the second coming of Christ and whatnot. So, please go ahead and order yourself a copy as usual. Link in the episode description. You can place an order on Amazon. Please read it. I hope you do read it, and I hope that you're blessed by it. All right. Well, as always, I've had a great time going through Scripture with all of you. I hope that you've had a good time as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.